That Stephanie White refuses to credit Caitlin Clark, especially in front of the team. Like, she already didn't want to give her no credit for the game winner versus the Washington Mystics when she bailed her out. Now Caitlin Clark bailed you out again, you and Kelsey Mitchell, but for whatever reason, you want to keep trying to credit Kelsey Mitchell at the podium. It's weird.
Nobody saw it coming. One moment, Caitlin Clark was the most talked about name in women's basketball. The next, she was quietly, deliberately making a decision that would shake the entire WNBA to its foundation. And the strangest part, it didn't happen in a trade meeting. It didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened on camera, in front of millions of people, and almost nobody caught it in real time. But once you see it, once you understand what was actually happening in that gym, in those final minutes, you cannot unsee it. This is the story of how one of the greatest talents in the history of this sport was pushed to a breaking point by the very people who were supposed to protect her. And it starts not with a scandal, not with a blow-up, not with a press conference. It starts with silence. The most damaging kind. Picture this: Indiana Fever locker room post-game, and the Fever just won. Not barely, won, not scraped through. They dominated, and the reason they dominated is standing in the corner of that locker room, still catching her breath, having just delivered one of the most statistically remarkable rookie performances in WNBA history. 30 points. 7 rebounds. 11 for 11 from the free throw line. 11 of 11. Perfection under pressure. And the head coach walks to the center of that room, looks at her players, and opens her mouth. What comes out is not what you'd expect. Not what anyone would expect. She talks about growth. She talks about togetherness. She talks about process and belief and coming together as a unit. Generic corporate coach speak that could apply to any game, any team, any night. And in the 60-plus seconds that follow, one name is never mentioned. Not once. Caitlin Clark. You feel that, sit with that for a second, because that silence is not accidental. Coaches don't accidentally forget their leading scorer after a game like that. Coaches don't accidentally omit the player who just won 11 of 11 from the line in a crucial win. That silence was a choice. And Caitlin Clark heard it loudly. But here's where the story gets complicated, because right after that locker room moment, Stephanie White walks out to the press podium, and suddenly, she finds plenty to say. The cameras are rolling. The reporters are leaning in. And White begins constructing a very specific narrative about that game. She talks about bookends. She frames the win around having a point guard and a center working in sync. Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston clearly. But then, almost mid-sentence, she pivots. She pivots to Kelsey Mitchell. She credits Kelsey Mitchell's quiet 19 points as if it were the emotional backbone of the victory. Quiet. 19. On 7 of 17 shooting. From a player who, in the final minute of that game with a 5-point lead and everything on the line, forced one of the most unnecessary shots you'll ever see at that level. A contested layup that came off her own leg. That shot cut the lead to 3. That shot invited chaos back into a game that should have been closed. And yet, standing at that podium, Stephanie White was treating Kelsey Mitchell's night like it deserved a Grammy. Why? That's the question that starts pulling at you, and the more you pull, the more unravels. Because this wasn't a one-time thing. This was a pattern, and once you understand the pattern, the entire season reframes itself in a way that's almost unsettling. Think about the dynamic in that locker room. You have Caitlin Clark, a 22-year-old rookie who arrived with more national attention than anyone in WNBA history. More eyeballs. More jerseys sold. More cameras. More everything. And then you have Kelsey Mitchell, a talented, experienced player who had been the face of this franchise before Clark arrived. Before the sold-out arenas. Before the record TV ratings. Before the highlight reels that were lighting up every platform every single night. Now, imagine being Kelsey Mitchell in that environment. Your identity, your status, you're standing on this team, all of it quietly being eclipsed by someone younger, someone newer, someone who hasn't even been here a full year. That's a psychologically difficult position to be in, and most people would understand some level of internal friction. That's human. What's not human, what crosses a completely different line, is what appeared to be happening next. Because when you watch the film of that game against Chicago, when you study the final overtime possession, something jumps out that you cannot explain away with coincidence or poor judgment or nerves. Caitlin Clark was open. unmistakably open. And it wasn't a design play breakdown that left her there.
It was a design play that had been changed.
The original look was supposed to get Clark the ball in a pick-and-roll set that had worked for the Fever repeatedly across the season.
Simple.
Effective. Logical. She was 11 of 11 from the line. If she got to the paint, it was either a basket or 2 points at the stripe. You don't need an advanced analytics degree to understand that calculus. But something changed. The ball moved to Kelsey Mitchell instead. And what happened next sits at the center of this entire story because Mitchell dropped it. A critical overtime possession evaporated. And the camera caught Caitlin Clark's hands going up. Not in celebration. Not in confusion about her own positioning. In that specific, unmistakable way athletes communicate when they realize the play they were promised never came. She'd been left out in the cold. Now people have argued this was just a coaching decision. A read. A moment-to-moment adjustment in the flow of the game. And maybe in isolation, that argument holds water. But you have to zoom out. You have to stack it against everything else: the silence in the locker room, the pivot at the podium, the relentless insertion of Kelsey Mitchell into a narrative that the numbers simply didn't support. And when you zoom out, the picture changes. It doesn't look like a coaching decision anymore. It looks like a message. And Caitlin Clark, who is not naive, who didn't arrive at this level by missing subtext, received that message clearly. Here's what makes this emotionally devastating when you really think about it. Clark isn't someone who demanded a statue. She wasn't holding press conferences about her contributions. She wasn't talking to media off the record, planting stories, lobbying for her own legacy. She was just playing basketball. Historically good basketball. The kind of basketball that lifts an entire franchise, fills arenas, saves television deals, and reminds casual fans why they fell in love with the sport in the first place. She wasn't asking for a parade. She was asking to be mentioned after putting up 30 points. She was asking for the play to actually come to her when she was open, 11 of 11 with a game on the line. That's it. That's the ask. And it was being denied. Systematically. By the two people in that building who should have been her loudest advocates. What followed in the days after that game was quieter, but in some ways more revealing. Because sometimes it's not the explosion that tells you everything, it's the stillness afterward. Clark's body language shifted. Something imperceptible to a casual viewer but immediately obvious to anyone paying attention. The kind of emotional withdrawal that happens when a person has made a decision internally and is now simply executing what remains before they can leave. She was still competing, still scoring, still making plays that defied her experience level. But the eyes told a different story. The investment was changing. The belief that this environment deserved her best self, that belief was eroding quietly, irreversibly. And here's the twist that reframes the entire conspiracy angle, because calling it a conspiracy is a big word, and this story deserves precision. What Stephanie White and Kelsey Mitchell appeared to be doing was not rooted in evil. It was rooted in fear. Specifically, the fear of irrelevance. White had a roster she understood, a system she'd built, an identity as a coach with a certain kind of culture. And then Caitlin Clark walked in and changed the gravitational pull of everything. Suddenly, the team's identity wasn't about the system, it was about Clark. Suddenly, the conversations weren't about White's coaching, they were about Clark's ceiling. And if you're a head coach who needs to feel necessary, who needs to feel like the architect rather than just the caretaker, that's terrifying. So you start making choices that remind yourself and everyone around you that you still hold the power. You omit names. You reframe narratives. You change plays. Small moves, individually defensible, but collectively, they tell a story. And Kelsey Mitchell? Mitchell had earned her place on this team through years of difficult, honest work. She'd been the offensive engine on losing teams. She'd stayed when she could have gone. And now she was watching a rookie do in 6 months what she couldn't do in 6 years, make Indiana Fever basketball must-watch television. That's not an easy thing to process gracefully. And there's evidence she didn't process it gracefully. The shot she took when the game was already managed. The quiet tension in shared spaces that cameras occasionally caught. The way, in certain moments, the ball simply didn't find Clark when it should have. You don't have to invent a villain here. The reality is more complicated than that, which is what makes it so much harder to watch. Because there's no evil genius in this story, just human beings making self-protective choices that collectively built a cage around the greatest player in their building. And Caitlin Clark sat in that cage long enough to understand its shape completely. Then she decided she was done. The confirmation didn't come dramatically. There was no screaming match caught on a hot mic. No social media explosion. No agent-orchestrated leak to a beat reporter. It came in the way the most consequential decisions usually come quietly, privately, irrevocably. Sources connected to Clark's inner circle began signaling what those closest to the situation already sensed: this was her last season in Indiana.